So we are midway through our series called The Fruit of the Spirit. The fruit of the Spirit in Christ, because Christ is in us. And we today are broaching the topic of patience as a distinct fruit of the Spirit Paul mentions in Galatians 5:23 through 26. I'll read that before we get to our main passage just to refresh everybody. But the fruit of the Spirit is love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, faithfulness, gentleness, self-control. Against such things there is no law. And those who belong to Christ Jesus have crucified the flesh with its passions and desires. If we live by the Spirit, let us also keep in step with the Spirit. Let us not become conceited, provoking one another, envying one another. And we're going to chase the rabbit of patience in Jesus' life in Mark chapter 9 today. It's verses 14 through 29. These are the words of God. And when they came to the disciples, they saw a great crowd around them and scribes arguing with them. And immediately, all the crowd, when they saw him, Jesus, were greatly amazed and ran up and greeted him. And he asked them, "What are you arguing about?" And someone from the crowd answered him, "Teacher, I brought my son to you, for he has a spirit that makes him mute. And whenever it seizes him, it throws him down and he foams and grinds his teeth and becomes rigid. So I asked your disciples to cast it out, and they were not able." And he answered them, "O faithless generation, how long am I to be with you? How long am I to bear with you? Bring him here." And they brought the boy to him. And when the spirit saw him, immediately it convulsed the boy. And he fell on the ground and rolled about, foaming at the mouth. And Jesus asked his father, "How long has this been happening to him?" And he said, "From childhood. And it's often cast him into the fire, into the water to destroy him. But if you can do anything, have compassion on us and help." And Jesus said to him, if you can, all things are possible for one who believes." Immediately the father of the child cried out and said, "I believe, help my unbelief." And when Jesus saw that a crowd came running together, he rebuked the unclean spirit, saying to it, "You mute and deaf spirit, I command you, come out of him and never enter him again." And after crying out and convulsing him terribly, it came out, and the boy was like a corpse, so that most of them said, "He's dead." But Jesus took him by the hand and lifted him up, and he arose. And when he had entered the house, his disciples asked him privately, "Why could we not cast it out?" And he said to them, "This kind cannot be driven out by anything but prayer." One chapter before this, Jesus was looking at the 12 disciples and then pares it down to Peter, James, and John. And he says, "You three, come with me. The rest of you guys, stay here, hold down the fort." So Jesus takes them up a 9,000 feet journey, up a winding path, up a mountain called Mount Hermon. And it would have taken all the daylight hours to get there. And it seemed when they got there that Jesus was intent on praying through the night. He had this weird habit of doing that sometimes. It wasn't an all-the-time thing, but every once in a while, he would devote the entire night to prayer and just sit before the face of God. And Jesus was certainly praying. The Gospels are clear about that. The three disciples, though, were not. They had fallen asleep, like an ominous foreshadow of the betrayal and the failure they had experienced later in the garden when they fell asleep again when he needed them the most. But out of nowhere, this like blinding white light on the mountaintop pulls all the three disciples out of a sound sleep. And that light would have looked like the sun first. The Gospels tell us, actually, that Jesus' face was shining like the sun. And so if you've ever, woken up one morning with, had your eyes closed next to the window and your eyelids are sort of lit up, that's probably what they noticed at first and probably thought it was daytime until they opened their eyes and they see the sun's not out. It's Jesus shining every bit as bright as a noonday sun. And other gospel writers tell us that his clothes looked like they were bleached white, but whiter than you could ever get on this earth. And they look even closer, and they see two other people talking with Jesus while he's just glowing, which is weird because only 4 people went up that mountain, and now there are 6. We learn later it's Moses and Elijah. And just as the intensity hit its apex, they hear this voice yell in the sky. "This is my beloved son, listen to him." And with that, the light's gone. The 2 other people disappear. And it's just Jesus and the disciples under the stars of the Milky Way. When our passage picks up, they're on their way back down the mountain. And as they get down to the base of it, they start to hear this argument taking place. Sounds like this big public spectacle, and he comes off the mountain, and sure enough, that's exactly what's happened. Jesus steps down and goes, "Whoa, what are you guys arguing about?" And before either the scribes that his remaining 9 disciples were in a fight in, or the disciples could answer what they were arguing about, this voice, this desperate voice, kind of pierces the crowd. It's this haggard, tired voice, the voice of a parent out of answers. "Teacher, I brought my son to you, for he has this spirit that makes him mute, and whenever it seizes him, it throws him down, and he foams at the mouth, and grinds his teeth, and he becomes rigid. And now it's not hard to piece together what's happened and why this argument's taking place." This guy had come looking for Jesus with his demonized son, but didn't know Jesus was up the mountain. So Jesus gets there, or the guy gets there with his son, there's no Jesus. There are his 9 disciples, though. And that explains what he says next. Verse 18. "So I asked your disciples to cast it out, and they weren't able." And that failure is likely where the commotion started. See, by this point in Jesus' ministry, there was this cadre of Jewish scribes that were following Jesus wherever he went across the countryside. And the point of that was to just hang around long enough to wait for him to screw up. Kind of like if you've ever been on the interstate and you got like a traffic officer behind you for like 18, 20 miles. If they stay behind you long enough, something will go wrong, right? And they're trying to get evidence on him. So this is perfect because the disciples didn't study the scriptures nearly as closely or as in depth as the scribes did. But they could cast out demons. Now, most scribes didn't claim the ability to do that. Some did, but usually not so much. So this was a chance both to testify to the integrity and the wherewithal of their rabbi, Jesus, by casting the demon out. And it would also justify their credibility in working in the power of God, even though they didn't have the same level of knowledge as the scribes. But it goes terribly. It's an absolute disaster. Which is ironic because, man, a week before, the disciples did this and they were just fine. Mark chapter 6, Jesus had given the disciples his authority to go cast out demons. And they knocked it out of the park. They didn't even have to do it like other Jewish exorcists did at the time. This is what made Jesus and the disciples so different. Jesus and his disciples didn't have to use like weird incantations or potions or like these big long lists of like spirit names to try to cast out demons like most people at this time frame did. Jesus just used the authority of his person and said, scram, and it worked. And his disciples could do the same in Jesus' authority, except right now. This comes on the long losing streak of failure of the disciples, by the way. Jesus had saved their life twice in a boat, and each time they believed in him less, not more as a result. They misunderstood parables. They kept worrying about if they have enough food. Just been one kind of faceplant after another. So now, Jesus is coming off the mountain just like Moses in the book of Exodus, down off Mount Sinai to deal with the failure of those he left in charge, to find this embarrassing public spectacle. A frazzled dad who has no idea what to do, and disciples who've just walked right into a trap. And what happens next is hard to pinpoint, though. You can picture everything in Jesus' field of vision kind of tumbling into slow motion. He sees this dad beside himself with fear and grief. The disciples who've let him down again. The religious establishment who just wouldn't listen. And something stalls inside him. Jesus sees all at once how much work he has ahead of him. And this groan escapes his lips. Not angry, not vindictive, just despondent. Faithless generation. Faithless. How long am I to bear with you? How long am I to be here with you? He takes a few seconds, collects himself, and says, bring your kid over here. So the father brings his son to Jesus, right? And as soon as the spirit inside the kid sees Jesus, he flips out immediately. Just starts rolling on the ground, foaming at the mouth, all that junk. And what's so funny is Jesus just sort of takes it all in, right? This kid's going full on Linda Blair and rolling on the ground, and then Jesus literally just goes to the dad, how long has he been doing this? It's like a check engine light on a car or something. And the dad just goes since he was a kid, time and time again, if there was a fire pit or a thing of water, he's always jumping toward it, trying to hurt himself. None of that amazed Jesus. What did amaze Jesus, though, was what the Father said next. But if you can do anything, have compassion on us and help. If you can, bail us out. Jesus goes, if I can, all things are possible to the one who believes. And now you can see why Jesus was so frustrated with his disciples, can't you? Because to some degree, this dad believed Jesus could help his kid, at least before he came. But when he brought him, Jesus wasn't there. The disciples, who were supposed to emulate the wisdom and integrity of their master, had their shot. And when they failed, it didn't speak about their lack of power. It spoke about Jesus' lack of power. You've caused the blind to see, and we've blinded them again. Despite Jesus' time and energy and sacrifice for his disciples, they'd somehow left this guy worse off than if he'd never come at all. By now, what should have been a straightforward display of the kingdom of God, get the demon out, give the dad back his kid, it's a vaudeville horse and pony show. It's just a public spectacle. And the verse 25 gives the impression that Jesus is just trying to wrap this thing up as soon as possible. You can bring it across as something called causal. It's like because Jesus saw the crowds running at this point, he's like, nope, just rebuke the spirit, send them on the way, and they went indoors. And later when the disciples met with Jesus privately, they did a kind of autopsy on what happened that day. The disciples asked why the demon wouldn't leave when they did the same thing they did before. And Jesus' answer seems to connect the failure of the 9 below the mountain to the 3 on top of the mountain. Remember what he said? Well, that demon didn't leave because that kind can't be driven out by anything but prayer. And I wonder if he looked at the 3 whom he brought up the mountain to pray. And they were fast asleep. And with that, the account's over, and we're left picking up the pieces. So, here's a $64 question. What does this say, if anything, about the patience of Jesus? Because at first glance, this seems exactly like the wrong story to tell then, doesn't it? Except for the fact that it's perfect. It is totally perfect. Because the first thing it does is challenge our crunchy, like evangelified idea of what patience is. Like it's not ripping into the lady at McDonald's if they get your McMuffin wrong. Well, then that's patience, everyone. No, that's not. It's not patience. That's self-control. That comes later. In Galatians 5, the fruit of patience, you can translate it as either long-tempered or forbearing. Right? So it speaks to two things. The fruit of patience speaks to two things. The ability to endure suffering for like a long period of time and not quit. That's the first one. And the second one is the ability to put up with the imperfections of people without retaliating. So it's endurance and forbearance. That's what the fruit is. And this story shows us both. Jesus is putting up with suboptimal, slow results of his life's work and showing this forbearance with his disciples without apologizing for the frustration it causes. Because that frustration, many of you will know this, sometimes it's the curse of knowledge and it's the curse of vision. Suffering is so much worse when you know how awesome something could be and it's placed there in all its mediocrity with a thing that is. You see the two right together, and you see just how far you have to go. The absence of patience, then, is what happens when the distance between what could be and what is looks so far, it overpowers your faith to continue. During the Dust Bowl in the 1930s, younger children of more experienced farmers learned how quickly faith could be lost. The soil on the plains of Texas, Kansas, and Oklahoma, and even further north, had been obliterated by that point. It's a historic drought, and water had become so scarce that to waste any was a crime against those you love. There was a record number of deaths of livestock dying from dehydration and dust inhalation. And soon the longing for water became like a physical ache. Like everything in you wanted to see it, not just your eyes. And sometimes kids who would play outside after dark would see something on the horizon that would stop them in their tracks. They'd see this pulse, this pink flash in the distance. They'd see one, then two, then five. They thought, the rain. That's a storm. Where there's lightning, there's storms. And when there's storms, there's rain. We made it. Drought's over. They'd go indoors, tell their parents, there's lightning over there, just a few miles away. It wasn't a few miles away. It wasn't even in the same county. It might not have even been in the same state. That is the tragedy of heat lightning during a drought. Heat lightning is just normal lightning. It's just too far away to hear any thunder. See, heat lightning is kind of a misnomer. There's nothing about that lightning that makes it different. It's just too far to hear anything. And what we call heat lightning happens on certain warm summer nights when there's just enough dust and there's just enough upper level moisture to act like an edged mirror in the atmosphere or like a dirty periscope. And what it does is it lets you see things so far away you shouldn't be seeing them. And it can let you see a storm 200 miles away. And you think it's right there. I say that because I think a lot of you feel as though your whole life has been nothing but heat lightning on an oppressively summer night. The good, like legitimately beautiful things you've prayed for, worked for, did everything in your power to make happen. They look like they're going to come around, and then they don't. like getting a job for what you actually went to school for. Having a husband or a wife that actually gives a rip. Having children. They all look like they're about to happen, and then right until they don't. And the response is a groan. Jesus groaned. And the frustration you hear from Jesus in this story is not him losing patience. It's not it. It's what sometimes actual patience sounds like. The disciples were so far from the goal he had for them that this primal longing escaped his lips, a longing for the day when this particular season of just like endless striving and no results would finally be behind him. His response isn't wrong, it's biblical. Because real patience grows. That's the first thing this passage tells us about the patience, the fruit of the Spirit. Real patience can grow. One of the central fixtures of the New Testament, it's this idea that both the desires and longings in your heart right now actually correspond to something in God himself. It's a very strange concept. Like, you'll have desires here, and the reason they're there is because there's some version of that that exists inside the Godhead. They're connected. In Romans 8, we see that those who belong to God, quote, have received adoption as sons that makes them cry, Abba, Father. And that cry is a proof that they belong to God through Jesus. What that cry is just appealing to God for relief and mercy on the basis of the fact that you know each other. That's the Abba cry. Provided, verse 17 says, we suffer with him. Romans 8 goes even further, saying that God's people groan inwardly because, why? They're the first fruit of the Spirit, and they're groaning for the full and complete expression of their adoption as sons of God. But then it goes even further and says that the way we wait with patience, the way Christians, believers in Jesus, wait with patience is connected to the way the Spirit helps us in our weakness. How does it help us? By interceding for us with groanings too deep for words. When you groan, the Spirit in you is groaning. And it's a proof that you and God at some level want the same thing. In the New Testament, the cry of Abba Father is used to communicate agonizing endurance, nested with an ironclad trust that somehow, some way, God will come through for you. Most of us have heard that the cry of Abba Father, it's like this infant who coos at the dad, and it's like something a baby would say to their dad, and that's a too simplistic idea of it. Most of the New Testament associates the cry of Abba Father with incredible suffering. You when Jesus says, Abba Father, it's not during like the serenity of this awesome prayer time. It's when he's been betrayed in the Garden of Gethsemane, asking any way but this. Anywhere but here. Anything but your judgment. One theologian calls it the scream of the crucified. And that makes sense. The groaning of Christ-powered patience then has underneath it the desire for God to fix your brokenness, yes, but also the world that made that brokenness possible. And all of this adds a new energy to the way we groan in suffering, doesn't it? Some of you have tried for years to conceive, only to like lose your baby at 5, 6, 7 months. I talked to a couple a while back. They lost their baby at 7 months because the umbilical cord had wrapped around its neck. It tried for 6 years to get pregnant. And then that just happens. It just dropped right on them. What would the patience of Christ have you do then? The patience of Christ in you groans. So groan away. Learn to spit on a broken world where caskets for babies and children are actually a necessity. and groan for the renewal Jesus will bring when he comes back, and he'll set that world right. Some of you have helped, mentored, invested in people for years. And they keep resisting real life change, stay selfish, and then blame you for not doing enough. The patience of Christ in you then groans. It groans that they would mature, and it groans with realistic, durable love for those around you who in their own way are still learning to walk. The reason it does this, because this is the second thing the passage shows us, patience keeps going even while you're groaning. Christ in you, just like Christ in Mark 9, can walk and chew gum at the same time. He can be frustrated and faithful to his disciples simultaneously. And the fruit of patience he produces in you allows you to do the same. The defining characteristic of supernatural patience is how it combines faithfulness with where God put you, right now, and the ability to vocalize your suffering in a way that honors God and honors one another. People, though, tend to divide into two camps. We're not good at doing two things at once. Some of us, we're more prone to groan than we are go. Invest in people, disciple, stay checked in. You don't feel like, if you're in that crowd, you don't feel like you can invest in people, fight for your marriage, your kids, or stay engaged at work, or forgive people until your depression lifts and your kids start appreciating you more. And somehow things have to turn around right now in order for this to make sense. In response, you shut down. You check out until whatever's vexing you leaves. The problem with that is we don't know how long that which is troubling you will stay, which is why the patience of Christ doesn't work like that. It enables you to go and keep at it while you groan. The patience of Christ in you refuses to let you shut down when it's all you want to do. For some, I think that temptation probably takes the form of tons of streaming movies, just forget about the job you hate. Bars of Xanax. Or you'll pickle your brain and your liver in whiskey or Chardonnay to drown everything out. For others of you, that temptation to shut down takes a different form. I did a little research this weekend. I found out the National Suicide Hotline receives 5,500 calls. Not every year, not every month, every 24 hours. And if that's you, if that headspace resonates with you, let me just say, God hasn't forgotten you. There's a category in the Bible for where you're at. Paul himself, the guy who wrote the fruit of the Spirit passage, wrote to a church in 2 Corinthians and said, I don't want you guys to be in the dark about the affliction I experienced. We were so utterly burdened beyond our strength that we despaired of life itself. Even the best among us want to die sometimes. Someone could rightfully say, though, all right, I'll grant the groaning thing, but just because someone's groaning or griping about something doesn't mean that's coming from the Spirit. And I would say, yeah, fair point. Not every piece of negative emotion is consistent with the way Christ's Spirit groans in us. Sometimes we grumble vindictively that the world hasn't presented itself to us in the way we thought it should. And to the vindictive, the bitter, I would remind you that God's central plot for your life isn't your happiness, it's Christ's likeness. Let that relieve you. Getting your head around that can restrain us from becoming self-absorbed black holes of bitterness and narcissism and oversensitivity that pull everyone into our vortex of drama. Sometimes the grace of God is just to stabilize you and keep you from wavering all the time. And as soon as you get your head around the idea that God's plot for you isn't less than happiness, but it's way more, that allows you to assimilate the diversity of the real human experience into your understanding and not have it like baffle you. Your life kind of starts making sense, even if it's terrible in the moment. Jesus also refused to make the ways he'd been wronged the defining feature of his life, and Christ in you will do the same. But some of you have the opposite problem. Like, your problem isn't like you groan and don't go, that you unplug and just check out. Your problem is maybe you try to go, do the things God's called you to without groaning. In other words, you make yourself super busy and pretend like everything's okay, and refuse to acknowledge your suffering for fear of like being too emotional. You sign up and volunteer for God knows what and God knows why when you're already stretched as it is, because there's in the background of your head some like folksy homespun wisdom that's like, you can't show emotion, you can't slow down. That's what it means to be patient. It's not what it means. I'm convinced there's probably some people here, like they'd be on the verge of a nervous breakdown, and the first thing they'd think is, maybe we should do 4-H. I promise you that won't help. And I understand lots of people here have like this stoic Scandinavian heritage. I get it. As a result, you're prone to bottle things up and not talk about your problems and pretend you're fine. But I would say having some heritage doesn't justify misrepresenting the cry of the Spirit inside you for renewal. Pleading with God for your transformation. I'm Irish. That doesn't mean I can like be publicly intoxicated and set trash bins on fire if my soccer team loses. And you might say, well, that's a little different. They are, but only a little. And here's what I mean by that. Both misrepresent the work of the Spirit in me. At the very least, the patience of Christ in you makes your suffering visible, or wants to make your suffering visible, so the mercy you'll receive from God will be visible to others too. I know some of you resist this because you've seen like drama lords whose version of authenticity has all the maturity of, I don't know, like a Jersey Shore episode, and you've been around people who like steer every conversation, everything toward like their drama, their problems, their issues. If that's the case, I get it. So let me emphasize that that's not what Christ in you wants to produce. But moreover, this will only happen to you. You'll get the balance right. You'll get the balance right when, third, you embrace the beauty of God's long game. There's an old pastor named Charles Spurgeon, and he said something that I can remember, I can mark my life between the first time I read it and after I read it. Here's what he said. Your life and God's care is like a wheel. Because sometimes your part of the wheel is at the top, and later it's at the bottom. Sometimes it's exalted, and sometimes it's in the dust. Then it's lifted into the air, and then again, by a single revolution, it's brought back down to the mud. So it is with your life. Sometimes we're humble in poverty and hardly know what we should do for bread. But the wheel turns, and we're brought into comfort of wealth. Our feet are in a spacious room. We have more than enough food. And then again, we're brought low into affliction and famine. A little while, and another page is turned, and we're exalted to the heavens. We can sing and rejoice to God, and then we're back in the mud. All your life has been on a wheel. Our own experience is never a stable thing. It's always changing, always turning around. Embracing the long game of God lets you ride that wheel without losing your mind. That's what it does. Hebrews 5, 7 through 9 says, although Jesus was a son of God. He learned obedience through what he suffered. And being made perfect, he became the source of eternal salvation to all who obey him. Jesus, too, was ground into the mud of affliction. And your suffering, like his, isn't some obstacle that God has to overcome to do his work in you. The suffering you're undergoing is like an irreplaceable means by which that work will happen. Like it wouldn't happen without it. Hebrews 12 says, it's for discipline that you have to endure. God is treating you as a son. So when stuff goes sideways, it doesn't mean he hates you. That's what it means. It's a theology of suffering that is actually made of some steel. You don't have to go there and assume he's ticked at you. We're called to share in Jesus' kingdom, and we're not going to be exempt from the suffering that the kingdom is founded on. Jesus, too, was fashioned in the furnace as a sharp blade, experiencing the hot, cold transition from being in the water and out of the water, in the mud and rising from the mud. God's goal in your suffering isn't to make you happy or depressed. God's goal is to make you dangerous. That's the goal. Specifically, dangerous to Satan's kingdom. And people who haven't patiently suffered aren't dangerous to Satan's kingdom. They're just dangerous to one another. You know what I mean? Someone who hasn't sat in affliction for a while, imagine going to a dentist who never knew the terror of sitting in a dentist chair. Right? God has to wound the people he uses. Realize what God said about the Apostle Paul after he confronted him on the road to Damascus? He says, Paul is someone who will carry my name to the Gentiles. Acts 9:16, and I will show him how much he must suffer for the sake of my name. And that's the man, 10 chapters later in Acts 19, who is so effective for the kingdom of God, even demons had heard of him. You want to be used by God for reasons I don't always understand, he has to break you. Because when he puts you together, man, you are lethal for all the right reasons. And your suffering is not wasted. Some of you come from families known for being permeated with abuse, dysfunction, like tragedy. There's something dark and sinister in that gene pool. That's what you feel like. You look at your grandfather, your dad. This unstoppable force that's slowly marching toward you to amplify the sins of your fathers all over again. You've begged God to keep the shrapnel of that legacy from hitting your kids. And the way God's going to do it, and he will, is he'll reverse engineer your suffering to make you better, not worse. He'll keep your kids from that tidal wave of abuse, drugs, crime, depression. He'll do it. And you'll take that legacy into the ground with you. Just like Jesus disappeared with our legacy into the earth and took that sucker into the ground with him right before he was raised from the dead. Riding that wheel, embracing the long game, it also means the wheel will come up at one point. It did for Jesus too. The whole point of passages like you'll read in Romans 8 is to show us that patience in God yields the character we'll need to rule as kings and queens. I'm not making that up. It's Romans 8, 1 Peter 1, and 2 Peter 1. You will rule and reign with Jesus. That's why Paul says one day you'll judge angels. He's forming something in you that fair seas and a life that makes sense can't do for you. So be patient. Everyone you've truly admired was sculpted through circumstances that made them want to retaliate, refuse forgiveness, check out, stick a pistol in their mouth, isolate themselves, quit altogether. And the fruit of Christ in you, patience, you know what that is? That's thunder. Thunder that proves the rains are coming after all. The substance of things hoped for, the evidence of things unseen. A kind of rumbling in the distance that means Jesus is coming, and he brings his reward with him. One tangible way we can embrace God's long game is actually the Lord's Supper. Remember what Paul said in 1 Corinthians? In taking the supper, you proclaim the death of the Lord Jesus until he comes. That's what we do. Jesus himself said, I won't eat of this bread and drink of this wine until we're together in the kingdom. And so when you do this, do this in remembrance of me. Not to feel sorry for me, to give yourself a visual reminder that the check's in the mail, and I intend to return.